Yeah. Thank you. One of the great surprises and delights of my year so far was to walk into my kitchen on June 17th, my birthday, and find Dave Coop standing in my kitchen, and I was so disoriented by the lack of context for seeing Dave there unexpectedly, being surprised by friends and family who had planned something special for me. I was really grateful for that moment. Well, we're all part of a great story. 2 years ago, we had our first Historia conference here, and we discussed where we are in that story. How do we relate to that story? What part of the story are we telling? What part of the story is being told through us? The Book of Books, the great collection of stories, 66 books, 48 authors across 15 centuries, probably the most studied, the most reviled, the most cherished, the most burned, the most sacred, and the most banned book in history. Now that in itself, adolescents, should make you want to read it. Full of sexual intrigues, full of conflict, full of compromise, moral and spiritual compromise, full of all the things that make life so suspenseful and mysterious. And what is it that we're reminded by great storytellers? That the story is often something that surprises us, but we read it with expectation and delight because even if we know how it comes out, we want to hear it again. What is it about children when they're read stories? They want to hear it again. Read me that story. My daughter, when she was a little girl, loved the story of Greedy Gregory. And she would ask me to read this story over and over again about a boy who wanted something from the Tooth Fairy. And we'd read it over and over again. She'd heard the story many times. She'd practically memorized it. But she wanted to hear it again and again. What is it in our nature that wants to hear the reason we're here? Now, this is a sacred subject. Really, story is sacred. Because it's the entire process whereby we explore what it is to be human. What is it to be alive? I was thinking this morning, clouds overshadowing the sun, but I thought to myself, as I often do, where am I? I wake up sometimes. Many of you travel. I know Phil and Kathleen and Dave and Cheryl and so many of you, we travel a lot, and you wake up and think, where am I now? It's a context for us. It's a social and geophysical and cultural context for us. But sometimes you wake up in a new place, especially many of you have traveled to Asia. You wake up and you're in a very different culture, very different circumstances, very new language, new customs, things you have to adjust to adapt to be part of the story that's going on in that cultural context. So everything that takes place in our lives has a context. You may be here today and you may share a certain set of presuppositions with me or other people here who are on a faith journey. It may seem very similar. Or we may be on a faith journey, but we have very different assumptions about what that faith journey includes, about how we relate to our Creator. What is it the Creator expects from us? What is it we must learn or are learning? Are you conscious of that learning process? What does it take to become transformed? And how are we transforming others? By simply being faithful witnesses to what we've experienced. What are our stories? What is it that we've learned that we could pass on to someone else that might be instructive to them? What is it that we've not learned and seem to keep repeating again and again? One of the great stories in Scripture is the repetition of ignorance and disobedience. The people of Israel were selected by God to be the repository of His transcendent truth and presence and revelation in a variety of forms, typologies, symbols, artifacts, the Ark of the Covenant, the things that all prefigured something truly transcendent. But what is it we could learn from the story of Israel? Well, for one thing, that it's a typology. This is a people group that reflects us all in some unique and precious way. This is why Israel really is different. Not just as a geopolitical nation state. We could argue about the demarcation lines and the rights of a Palestinian people within, of whom there are many Christians, people of faith, and people who are not, but still deserve the acknowledgement and respect of human dignity, do they not? That's part of our journey. part of our story, if you're a person who is a follower of the Lamb, and what a peculiar and precarious circumstance surrounds us as followers of the Lamb who is coming back as a lion. Story on story, layer on layer. There's so much to absorb, to learn, to understand who we are, where we've come from, where we are now, where we're going. The book depicts it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it was good. And he depicts what the order that's established. You go on in the book. And I'll tell you about a story of another friend who's reading the book for the first time. It's so fascinating to hear people's reflections as they read this encounter for the first time and have a context for the first time in life. It may not have been introduced to us in our postmodern secular educational environment. We are, for all of this, the insight and wisdom and profundity of the book of books, the Bible we call it, it hardly seems adequate. But we are possibly the most biblically illiterate culture at a time where we need wisdom more than ever before. The Bible itself exposes its imperfections, or at least the imperfections of the people who are depicted in it, because it wants us to see the reality of hope, the circumstances of life, the challenges of our place and position, so that no one would despair in feeling, I'm in a place that's too far down, too far out, too far gone, too far lost for even God to find me. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever had even a moment of despair? People take their lives in moments of despair. I'm acquainted with that even recently. People have taken their lives because they couldn't see one thing. Where are you in the story that's not yet finished? If we don't teach people, if we don't live alongside people, if we don't depict to people that we're part of a story of unity and diversity, a story of, well, listen, and I'll submit this to any of you, and I acknowledge right here and now, and I welcome all those of different journeys and faiths and philosophies and worldviews and outlooks. What a wonderful thing. I've always found Coastal is so welcoming to people who have disparate experiences, opinions, ideas. This is a place where you can bring your questions. This is a place where you can bring your doubts, your concerns, your conflict. Bring your anger. Bring your sorrow. Bring your despair. This is one of the things that in my early spiritual journey that attracted me to a man named Francis Schaeffer, who had a small community and a no-account cow path, really, in the Swiss Alps called L'Abri, the shelter. You're a bilingual culture. I don't need to explain the meaning, but what beauty of that was Schaeffer created a climate where he understood the postmodern mindset before anyone else I know had even coined the term. Schaeffer was decades ahead of his time. Schaeffer was half a century ahead of his time. Francis Schaeffer was one of the, if you're not familiar with him, I would urge you to get to know this great cultural storyteller. Because he was so, you read him today and you think he understood the times we're living in even now and how we got here. So part of story and part of the craft of story, and this part of what we're examining in this conference is the craft of story, the discipline of story, the professionalism of story, what it takes to get a story right, what it takes to begin with a screenplay. I know many of you are screenwriters. There are other writers. There are artists of all kinds, stripe, ability, and experience. And that was the point of Historia, was it not? Dave, sure. We talked about helping everyone tell their story and find their story. I thought Phil did a brilliant job last night of asking us, where are we in that journey towards story? Where are you? Have you been so fragmented and distracted and fractured that you don't really know what it is you are at the center of your being, at the core of your personhood, your gifts and calling and their application? You can discover gifts. Many of you have multiple gifts. You can even have a sense of your calling. Without the sense of discipline and desire and determination, you won't reach the zenith or the possibilities to optimize what it is your Creator has put in you. Now let me quickly acknowledge and step back from all this for a moment, just to give an account of different views of this. You may think, well, Gordon, you're so blithely optimistic and naively hopeful. It's nice to hear the Pollyanna religious rhetoric that comes from you and other Christians. But the truth is the alternative, and this is the shocking truth, the generally prevailing notion today is you are nothing but an accident of time plus chance plus matter. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the prevailing notion of existence that's being taught in the public schools I'm aware of in the United States today, and possibly across Canada. That's the prevailing notion. It's very hard to argue then at a certain level that there's any ultimate right or wrong other than the cultural and very limited local social context for what mores and ethics determine we should say or do or be. In other words, you can't really argue that something really is right or wrong other than that's your opinion. That's the prevailing notion of your subculture. And if that's all there is to argue from, then Nietzsche was right. Might makes right. Essentially, those with the most power. So the aggregation of power and postmodern utilitarianism is the prevailing undercurrent of politics in the world today. It is a most dangerous circumstance to suggest that might makes right. Now, power can be used for justice. Power can be used to enforce a higher sense of law and morality, but it's got to be based on something that transcends the immediacy of the cultural or subcultural needs of any people group. So what is it that you believe today about the context for your life and your story? It really matters. And I invite you, if you're on a journey here and you're traveling with other people who are of faith at various levels of their faith journey, and when I say faith journey, that you can put your faith in lots of things. I frequently put a great deal of faith in my JJ Bean in the morning, as I will now demonstrate. Now that just met all the conditions of every presupposition I had about caffeine. It may have exceeded a few. But you understand what I mean and why this is so important. We could talk about the mechanics of storytelling, and we'll touch on that. We could talk about the disposition of the storyteller and what it is you need to learn and what you need to focus on. And frankly, I don't feel qualified, having not written a novel or a screenplay, there are far better qualified people at this conference to talk about that. What I would like to reflect on is what I've worked in the world of translation. And the translation world for me has been looking at statistical reports frequently. I know this sounds prosaic and blasé to many of you, but on Madison Avenue we look at a lot of data, consumer data. And what are we basically studying? The needs, wants, and desires of people. The needs, wants, and desires of people, and how to satisfy them. I've basically flogged my wares by selling cars, clothes, and computers. I doubt that I've really improved culture very much. But on the periphery of that, having had a change of heart, and for those that don't know my story, which is the context for which you might feel that there's any value or authenticity to what I'm saying and what I've lived through, or frequently what I've suffered and learned from that suffering, as opposed to simply being hardened, embittered, and angry. And by the way, that is a result of what most people, and many people, perhaps not most people, but if you look around the world today, many people are simply developing a deeper and deeper suspicion that the world may actually have no meaning, that they have no value, why is it? Now, I don't know your position, for example, on the nature of existence, so I can't tell you that you or I know when life begins. But doesn't it seem to me, it doesn't seem to you as well, that every civilization is ultimately going to be judged by the way it adjudicates the rights and the needs and protects the most vulnerable among us? People who cannot stand up for themselves. People who cannot tell their own stories adequately. So what is our role as storytellers if it isn't in some measure to stand up for the needs of those who require justice and care and protection and compassion? And it seems to me logically, if on no other order, that at some point when it comes to the right to life and the nature of abortion, that at some point the bearer of the actions that lead to consequences has to live with the truth that they have created something that lives within their womb by purpose or accident, wanted or unwanted, that there is a life there. And whether we can distinguish the moment when that life begins and is based on viability or based on the nature of the uniqueness of its imprint or condition of a soul or a spirit, whichever definition you choose to use, does it not behoove us as a culture that believes anything is sacred, or that declaims that it believes in justice and the needs and the rights of those who are underrepresented? You want to talk about a group that's underrepresented, that's voiceless, and yet clearly feels pain and reacts to it? Those precious and beautiful life, the life within us that we create under whatever circumstances, does not life deserve a chance? Give life a chance. I understand you may be following the news, and I find most Canadians are more politically informed than many of my friends in the lower 48, but you may be following the challenge we have with law enforcement that is rogue law officers, and there are some, many, I don't know, but there is a disparity in some neighborhoods and circumstances and so on where people are being falsely accused or profiled in a wrong way. Look, when you see criminal behavior, you're likely to profile it. That's actually called police training. But when you wrongfully extend authority, you run into all kinds of problems. So we have a movement in the U.S. called Black Lives Matter. And of course they do. But the other narrative going on, this is the power of storytelling going on in our cultures today. This is story in the context of culture. The other narrative is all lives matter. And here's the danger. History is nothing more, I would venture to submit to you to consider, but a pendulum that swings back and forth, correcting excesses on one level and goes in the other direction. When there's a wrong, we tend to overly react at times. Sometimes we don't react strongly enough. But this is the social context for our stories and our storytelling. Yes, I could spend time today and tell you about what we've done with brands and how brands are built and what the assumptions are behind brand building, what the budgets are behind it. It's pretty easy to build a brand when you have a lot of money to spend. You just keep telling the same things over and over again. Which Marxist communist said, a lie, if told frequently enough, becomes the truth. Well, it really doesn't, does it? I want to attribute that to Marx or Engels, but it wasn't. It was one of their minions. But you look, and this is what, by the way, whatever your view of the people's Pope, Pope Francis was, I credit him for having gone to Cuba and 2 days ago, having, I'm told, said we are to serve people, not ideologies. That may be subtle, missed by some, but significant nevertheless. So how do our stories fit in with the larger story? How do we find where we are in that story? If you were to picture yourself on a continuum right now, where is your story in the ups and downs of life? Are you in a place of challenge and despair? Are you in a place of crisis? Are you in a crisis of faith? A crisis of hope? A crisis of need? Is there, go back to the needs, wants, and desires in the advertising industry. I was always trying to be conscious of the fact that there were certain semiotic codes that I needed to include in commercials and advertising to make sure that people knew that if you bought our product, your life really would improve in a variety of abstract and existential ways. If you bought this car, it will be filled with super attractive, fun people playing fabulous music. And you'll get great gas mileage, too. But we put less emphasis on the data surrounding the vehicle's performance and more emphasis on meeting a fantastical desire which we sought to associate with the product, clothing especially. How many people really look as beautiful as the models? And what fascinated me, and I hired these models to do runway shows, what fascinated me was the level of insecurity amongst some of the most beautiful people in this world. But she's a little more beautiful than me, and she just got that contract, and she got another contract. I dated, was privileged to know Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter. She was the first supermodel to receive $1 million contract from Revlon. And she was one of the most thoughtful, caring, beautiful, and fragile, insecure people I'd ever met. Her life ended in a dubious circumstance in Los Angeles. She may have taken her own life, like her papa. But what a tragedy that someone with so much gifting, so much beauty, so much possibility would end it all and just feel it was at a point of despair. And I've seen people, and you have too, who've had so many blessings, so many privileges, so many opportunities, but they feel a deep insecurity, or they're very competitive. There's never enough. You could name people in society today for whom there's never enough. I don't discredit people who have ambition, motivation, desire, and want more, want to achieve more. But it's certainly a reflection of a sense of deeper isolation and a lack of understanding our story when people do not know who they are and how valued they are, even when nobody else is looking and nobody else is attributing value to them. Ultimately, we're on a spiritual journey. So again, and I know we're talking to an audience here today that comes from very different places, and I think that's a wonderful thing, that we could inspire and challenge and ignite in one another deeper questions of life. But as Phil said last night, what is the one thing you're called to do? What is the one thing? Do you, having come forward last night, I thought it was a fantastic response last night, and it said something very, very observable, palpable, tangible, even measurable about this audience and about the significance of a conference like this. We're not here just to study the mechanics of screenwriting and storytelling. That's a part of it. Excellence in craft and artisanship is one of the reasons some people would say Christianity needs to be, forgive me for using this word, rebranded. That would be possible if Christianity were a brand. But everything I know about brands and brand personalities and the packaging and presentation of them could, you might argue, reflect something that's packaged, that's presented. There are artifacts, there's a subculture, there are components to this. It certainly revolves around the book, the story, the way we present the story, the way we live the story, the way the story is incarnated in our own lives. Media itself is demonstrated in one great act of mediation. The incarnation is the most extraordinary and powerful and specific display of media being something translated from one form into another, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. John's story. And when I'm around other people who are traveling with me, and I've invited more of my friends who do not share my Christian faith yet, I say that hopefully, but are open enough to say, do you know, and this happened to a friend of mine who's an extraordinarily talented politician in the United States. He was a self-described, self-declared atheist, and someone gave him a Bible in his mid-20s and said, you may as well see the body of work you've rejected. And he started reading the Gospels. And reading the Gospels, without the aid or confluence of other outside influences, he came to a place of faith. He said, whoever said this knows something about the human condition, knows something about my condition, and has a prescription for going forward. Now that's story. That's a part of the story. All of this is a story, and the story transcends the story. John says, If all the deeds that Jesus had done were written, there wouldn't be enough books in the world. So we have to start somewhere. And within these books, there's a specific and particular view that's expressed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's start with that story within the heart of the story. The story within the story is a reflection of, for Matthew, it's the importance of substantiating Jesus' genealogical position in the Jewish faith and creating a particularly Jewish Jesus. Because, what do you know? Jesus was Jewish. And we are grafted in. And why is it so important that people in the Christian journey become more cognizant of what the Judeo-Christian ethic and ideas have done to shape our thinking? Why is that so important? Because it's critical to it's the backstory to our story. Without that, you don't appreciate Sukkoth, you don't appreciate Rosh Hashanah, you don't appreciate Yom Kippur. By the way, holidays all just taken place in the last. And how many of us are cognizant of it at all? Oh, what's that? That's then. This is now. No, that's a particular part of our backstory that allows us to speak with refreshing vigor and insight into the Jewish community from whom we derived our faith. In a most unique way, we are grafted in as Gentiles. These are the specific details of narrative that contribute to story. And if you don't understand the narrative, you won't understand the story. So you can think you're at a certain place. Draw that line, that continuum in your mind today. Where are you in your story? It may not be the first time that you've heard a challenge to say, what is the one thing that you're about? It may have resonated with you. It may have caused you to go back to something in your past and say, I knew it once. I knew it more clearly as a child. Wasn't it wonderful to reflect last night with Phil on his childhood? Wasn't it wonderful? This is a significant part of our journey together. So in that context, you are being influenced by the culture around you. You say things, particularly as Canadians, if you'll forgive me for making this observation. I think in general you are a more consciously polite society than we have amongst the radical rebel rabble in the United States, which is part of our composite nature. We're revolutionaries and proud of it. We celebrate it with guns and fireworks and explosives on a regular basis. Unfortunately, and you could make an argument from a variety of points of view here, the refugee situation you're seeing in the world today, and I'll say this and I'll own this as a political observation, it will not be a surprise to many of you that there was a time only a few years ago when our president challenged Bashar al-Assad in saying, if you go any further than this, we will challenge you. War is not a pleasantry. It's not something any of us desire or aspire to. But when you see someone on the sidewalk being bullied, when you see someone who's being injured, when you see somebody who's under active and violent attack, please tell me that you would stand back and say, well, it's none of my business. Well, 2 minutes before that event, it might not have been your business. But at some point, moral responsibility and an awareness of the needs of someone you may have never seen before. You don't know the circumstances, but you see something, and something in you tells you it's wrong. Would you let a child be beaten savagely outside, an innocent child? Or even if it had been a naughty child? Would you stand by and watch a child being beaten? I seriously doubt it, even as Canadians. Forgive me. That was unnecessary. But in the U.S., there is a sense in which we feel, and give me the patience of trying to paint a picture, we feel in some way as a superpower, whether we are or not can be contested today, that we have with that a kind of moral obligation. You're never going to be popular as the policeman of the world, are you? By the way, you have Canadian troops in parts of the world where your Canadian troops don't want to be. They'd rather be home doing other things like all of us. You have Canadian troops here. You're risking life and limb, blood and treasure. But you're doing it not because you're a particularly onerous militaristic culture. You're doing it because you believe that people are suffering a vile injustice in parts of the world where they're crying out for help and getting none. And I want to underscore the fact that part of the refugee crisis we see in the world today is a reflection of the lack of conscience, courage, and conviction on the part of American political leadership. And I'll own that, and I'll take that to the networks. That is a part. Because we have failed to keep our promises. In other ways, I'm not saying it's a pretty, easy picture, and I'm not saying we are an empire-building colonialist culture. But I do believe there's something in the collective conscience of free people everywhere that wants to at least try to assure other people have a shot at freedom. That's part of our story. So culture has a political context for how we tell our stories. And it's not easy. The world is a mess. If you think you're telling a story that will be unsullied by your own disfiguring moral features, you've got another thing coming. Make a list, for example, of how many people you have aught against. Make a list today of how many people you feel bitterness, or disappointment, or unforgiveness. We're reminded, those of you who are on the Christian journey, that you can't afford that kind of liability. We're reminded that you cannot. In fact, you're commanded to let it go. I don't care how brutally you've been abused or wronged. Somehow we have to find the strength to forgive others. And the fracturing of the power of our presence and witness in the world today, our story collectively. You can't live the Christian journey alone. You may be more like Jesus than I am. That probably wouldn't take much. But I know as a debtor to grace how much I owe the Lord. And I am more frequently, as I think I mature in faith, more frequently, and I've observed this in other people who might be described as mature in their spiritual journey, more conscious of what I owe God than what I've accomplished in any form of outward spiritual maturity. It's virtually ridiculous. I just grow more in love with Jesus, and I pray that never stops. The one hope I have for being conformed to his image or finding any hope. And I don't figure, as Scripture relieves us of this burden, that I have to earn my salvation. I'll never get there. But I know how much I need a Savior. I know how much I need love. I know how much I need patience, forgiveness, all the fruit of the Spirit described in Galatians 5:22. I need it all. And if I'm not manifesting it all, it's because I'm not going to the vine, I'm not going to the well, I'm not going to the source of my story. I don't have a story without the story of one who gave his life for me. And maybe you don't either. And maybe you're here today and you're trying to find that story. I want to tell you a story of some boys that have affected my life, and this is where the intersection of our stories really matters in a social and cultural context. Earlier this summer, this goes way back. Some of you know that I'm the only child of an only child of an only child, and I have an only child. And at one time, I lived with one each of 4 generations of my family in the same house, a 104-year-old house that I'm still living in today. My mother passed away, and I've inherited the house that was built in Michigan from my great-grandparents. And my great-grandmother was the first recording artist. She played the ladies' silver coronet. Her name was Anna Teresa Berger. She married Lee Lynch. And she was discovered by a young hip-hop producer named Thomas Alva Edison. Whatever hip-hop meant then. I'm joking, of course, but he had a wax cylinder device whereby he could, as he described it, record and repeat all sounds, articulate and inarticulate. And you could go and hear my great-grandmother play with Edison recording her and playing it back for a hefty price of 25 cents. In the course of that, that story was passed on to me, and sadly, as a teenager, I thought my grandmother's going to tell me more of the story, and I want to go out and do something else. You're missing things when your family is trying to impart the truth of your social story. This is why there's such a fascination with Ancestry.com and people wanting to understand the genealogical context of their stories. Go back to Matthew telling a genealogical story about the provenance of Yeshua as the Messiah, Jesus our Messiah. And Mark looking at him as the man of action to translate for the Hellenistic and the Christian or the Hebrew world. And Luke, looking at it from, as a physician, looking at it from another context, as an educated Hellenistic writer who wanted to understand what was the compassionate side of Jesus. And John, looking at him with startled, wide-eyed wonder and saying, this is the transcendent Word made flesh. In that composite narrative, you have a story complete. In our composite narrative, as followers of the Lamb and the Lion and the Book, we're a unique people. We're a strange people. This is utterly childish, silly stuff if you don't get your head around how big the cosmos really is and how important fairy tales are. C.S. Lewis said, when I became a man, I was told by social context of storytelling that I would get past the things of childhood, that those are the things that kept me back. Lewis writes in writing about story, said, the very things that I discovered with wonder in childhood were the things that, in fact, make me more human. In fact, make me a better man. We can love those mysteries and those truths that were innocently revealed to us at another point in life and then add to it because of our experience as we become mature adults. So how does that affect your story, your storytelling, your story calling, your story expression, and whatever means it be? And your means here today may be, well, Gordon, I'm not a screenwriter, I'm not a novelist, I'm really not an artist, but in a way we are all part of a created order, and you're telling a story just by being here. Just by being here, part of your story is a hunger for that. The hunger I saw last night was so palpable and beautiful because we want more than anything to get that part right, don't we? Why are we here? Why are we listening? What is the context for this? I have so many notes and lectures that talk about the mechanics and industry details of what these semiotic codes look like when they're buried in a story. I'll go back to C.S. Lewis again. Lewis reminds that if you want to get a point across, he says, hide it in romance. Why is that? We laugh, but it's mostly females laugh. Men, we could be slightly more romantic, I suppose. But why is that a truth? Because it's love at the very center of our being. I reckon that in this beautiful but broken world, the one thing I want more than anything, and you've heard me say this from this stage before, is to be understood and to understand others and to share that understanding through story. That's how essential and fundamental storytelling is to our lives. So this comes down, and you're going to hear more from Phil and Jim Kruger. You're going to hear more about the art of story. You're going to hear more about the boldness, the courage to tell your story. The courage. It's very hard for me to talk about drug addiction to cocaine for me and how, because I was in denial the whole time. It's very hard for me to talk about 6 years of alcoholism and almost constant drunkenness, even while I was managing multi-million-dollar portfolios and projects. Fake it till you make it? I was such an injured soul, and I wanted everyone to believe my story. My story was especially important to me because it was inauthentic. It was a Hollywood facade on an empty street, nothing behind it, nothing behind me. I was empty and alone, even though I had a faith encounter in my earlier in life, and then I'd walked away from it because I felt I'd failed. And that feeling of failure and that fear that came with it, and a failed relationship, a failed marriage in my 20s, caused me to go blindly on a path that just led to a spiral of destruction. I was supernaturally delivered. And some of you heard that story. Talk about a story. And I heard the words, I literally saw the words, choose life, like a ghosted impression on my retina, my sophisticated retina, more sophisticated than any satellite the Pennington has ever devised. With my eyes open and my eyes closed, just like the impression you see, the electrochemical impression you get on your retina. Your retina is a fascinating thing, by the way. Your retina has 90 million rods, 90 million super sensitive receptors in one retina, and 6 or 7 million cones. Hard to count. 6 or 7 million cones. Between that, I can see things that are so extraordinarily nuanced. My hearing is so nuanced. I'm literally hearing molecules rub together. That's how sophisticated and sensitive you are. When we talked last night, I got so much out of the talk last night about distraction. We struggle with it because I'm a very optically sensitive person. Hey, Gordon, why don't you have any slides today? Because I actually want you to hear my voice. And I want to conjure up your imagination. It's a funny thing. I love visual presentation. I do a lot of visual presentation. Love it. But there's a part of the human imagination that is shut down when you're overstimulated visually. And the reason I breathe and pause and want you to come into my words is because, well, the Word was made flesh. God spoke the world into existence. We speak our faith. We speak with authority. Our voices have a power and resonance and authority behind them. It's much further than vocal cords can express. And that's in part why I sometimes restrain myself as much as I want to see things, and I think it's fantastic. Presentations with visual support. But there's something that requires the support of the mental and moral imagination. C.S. Lewis understood this. At Oxford, when he'd give lectures, he'd fill the Sheldonian Theater with people who weren't even his students because they hung on his words. What can our words do? What can they change? How do we express our stories through words and images and actions? I want to start to conclude. I won't conclude entirely with this, but I want to tell you a story that's affected me and my story. It's an intersection of faith, and I started out telling you because I'm the only child of an only child of an only child, and I have an only child. And my parents were divorced when I was 2. I grew up fatherless. My dad visited me once by surprise when I was 4. My father inherited money, moved to Switzerland and Italy, bought the Maserati Formula One team, had an office in Modena next to an eccentric Italian named Enzo, bought cars from Enzo's garage, and had a very interesting life. And I never met my dad till I was 18 years old. Absent in my story was the impact of a father's presence and patrimony and discipline and the things that only a father can bring to that story. I now have a good relationship with my dad. I just talked to him on the phone. He's 90 years old. He's very sharp. He was just arrested for speeding. I don't think they didn't, correction, he wasn't arrested. He was pulled over for speeding. They looked at his license and said, "Sir, you're 90 years old," wondering if he was compos mentis. I think he was probably racing someone in a faster car than his Volvo station wagon. But this happens a lot. Forgive me for telling on my dad, but they pulled him over, "Sir," and they said, "Who was the President of the United States?" My dad looked up and said, "Abraham Lincoln." They let him go. Earlier this summer, I had the privilege of giving a speech to 200 boys, inner city boys mostly, who were part of something that ESPN's Mike Gottfried, one of the commentators on college football for 19 years on ESPN, very popular guy, invited me to come down with General Jerry Boykin, one of the supreme commanders of Delta Force, very interesting guy, and we talked to 200 young men who'd come from originally 16 chapters of a group called Team Focus, T-E-A-M Focus. And 15 years ago, God, as Mike described it, impressed on his heart that he should start a program for fatherless boys because he'd been fatherless and Mike knew that I'd been fatherless. He said, "Gordon, would you come and just give a word to these boys?" I thought, what could I say? And as I met these boys, I saw something extraordinary. Mike's formula, by the way, is genius. He took the Jesuit formula that says, "Give me the boy at 8 and I'll show you the man." Well, what does that mean? If you work with someone and you can discipline and shape their environment, shape their story to an extent, by social context and learning, you shape the man. By the way, that's the competition going on in our cultures. Whose story do you believe? Who's shaping your story on a regular basis, consciously or subconsciously? So after this experience, I met boys who experienced horrendous things. They'd seen their mothers at home, bring home Johns and sleep in prostitution. They'd seen drug addiction. In one case, a boy who was so comported you thought he'd just come from a very distinguished family and educational background. Young boy, 11, 12 years old. Said, "Mike, what had happened in this boy's background? 36 months ago, he saw his father walk in the room and blow his mother's brains out in front of the whole family." Not a pretty image to overcome. And these boys were so extraordinary because someone's invested in them and is mentoring them. Little did I know shortly after Dave came to visit me for my birthday, that my summer and my life would probably be changed the way it has been. My story has been impacted. Because I was riding my bicycle down the street in the small town where I live in Owasso, Michigan, and I came upon two boys, 16, 17 years old, on their skateboards, and I engaged them in conversation about what their plans were for the summer because school had just let out. Do you have any plans? Do you have any ambitions? Do you have any hobbies? Do you have any jobs? Do you have any hopes? What are you looking forward to? And I got really a blasé, blank response of disappointment and almost despair. And I became cynical and thought, these boys are going to end up in trouble or in the system. I went about 5 minutes the other direction. Something, my conscience, the Spirit of God, I'll let you decide, spoke into my heart and said, go find those boys. And they were a few blocks away. By the time I found them, it was getting dark. And I said, hey, be at my house tomorrow morning. I'll give you something to do for the summer. I had no idea what they were going to do. They were at my house the next morning. I said 9:35. They were there right on time. I opened up my garage and said, all I've got is a bunch of garden tools, a lawnmower, a hedge trimmer. I don't live in a gated community. It's not that fancy, but I live in a town that's got a really unique history, 15,000 people. Really, really fascinating town. It was one of the wealthiest communities per capita in the United States until the crash in 1929. Produced very interesting people. America's greatest impressionist painter came from Owasso, one of America's greatest political figures. America's greatest turn-of-the-century writer, bigger than Mark Twain or Jack London, James Oliver Curwood. Thomas Edmund Dewey, the politician twice nominated for president, came from my street. So it's a little town with a great history, but it's lost track of its own story. Part of the challenge in the community I'm living in, and I've lived in New York, I've lived in Los Angeles, lived in London, in Zurich, I've spent most of my life in big cities, and I can tell you, you can change the story of the culture around you more in a smaller community than a bigger city. And you can bloom where you're planted, places like that. Doesn't mean we leave the cities to others to tell those stories. But after those boys came to my home that morning, two boys were there. They went out and I said, let's clean and green up our community. And they proceeded to do that. And I said, let's especially find widows and elderly folk and disabled veterans, people that can't take care of their properties, and we'll clean it up for them, gratis. And I'll pay you. And I found out later as they came back the next day with a third boy, and the next day with a fourth, and the next week with a fifth and a sixth. Pretty soon I had a small troop there assembled in my driveway every morning at 9 a.m. And it would come and go, and some morning they'd say, what did you boys have for breakfast? And some of the boys, frequently, frankly, the boys said, nothing. There's nothing in our home to eat. Wow. That was kind of a shock to me. And as they went out and did more and more, the city told me I can't employ these boys, so they're really volunteers and they get gratuities. But they started making a difference, and one day I said, do you know how to address an adult? How do you do, Reverend Coop? How do you do, Dr. Coop? How do you do? And look him in the eye, shake his hand, look him right in the eye. Don't look down, don't fidget, be square off with your hands in front of you, at your side or behind you after you shake hands, and treat him with respect and call him sir. They'd never heard this. You do the same thing with ladies. How do you do, ma'am? Well, as this started to spread, these boys started doing projects around the community, and people started noticing boys who are, working. Teenage boys in the United States are not generally induced to do much work. They're playing video games and other things. I know I'm generalizing, but it's actually kind of true. And as these boys start greeting people, it spread around my small town that there are polite boys alive in this country, working in this town. Who are they? What motivates them? It spread. It turned into almost a kind of movement. And we'd pay these boys, and one of the boys, the first time he got paid, went, by the way, he'd been rejected by his father at birth. He hadn't seen his mother. He's 17 now. He's seen his mother twice since he was 12 because of addictive behaviors and other problems. He's in foster care, and he took the first money he'd made. He's lost two of his siblings to suicide in the last 48 months. And 2 years ago on Christmas Eve, their home burned. They lost the few gifts that they had to share with each other, and they were homeless. Pretty tough life. Smart kid, capable kid, love this kid. I've fallen in love with this kid. And he took the first money he'd made, and he bought his foster father a pair of shoes. It was the first new pair of shoes his 44-year-old foster father had ever had. He did something for his foster father before he did something for himself. Local shoe store owner heard about it, bought him. I took him in the first time he'd been in a new shoe store. He said, wow, look at all the new shoes. Do we know how many young people, maybe not in Vancouver, but around this country and around the world, don't have the privileges and blessings we take for granted as part of our stories? So my story's been changed by a group of boys that I'm continuing to mentor. They go in for 2 hours of mentoring. And Tuesdays, we took 3 to 5. We had our city mayor, we had educators, historians, we had members of law enforcement, all kinds of people come and spend time with these kids who'd never had anybody take the time of day for them in many cases, except to maybe yell at them or overcome challenging circumstances in their lives. That's been part of my story. That's my social context. That's where I've been. That's where I am. I don't know where I'm going next. At the same time, I get phone calls. Once in a while, I've gotten phone calls from advisors of 3 different presidential candidates in the United States. I don't think they take my advice because they said, get a different speechwriter, make different points in the debates. And one of the candidates is an old friend. And another candidate asked me to be a media advisor to him. And I told him to do some things in the last campaign that I think we struggle. We're in a crisis of leadership in our countries. I think it's probably true in Canada too. Why? Because we have a better story to tell. We have a better story to tell. How will you tell that story? How will you be part of that story? What will you do to transform the world or be transformed? Romans 12:2, Paul says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may demonstrate what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. 3 levels, 3 different conditions. How will your story convey the good? How will your story convey the good? How will your story convey that which is acceptable in the sight of others in a social and cultural context? And how will your story finally translate what the Bible describes as perfect? Is really from the Greek word teleios, mature, complete. How will you complete your story? Last night we talked about starting out in that one thing. Maybe you're still wrestling with what your story is going to be. What is it you're going to pour yourself into? I can only tell you, if you're like me, someone has poured himself into you. And he's determined that you will succeed. Because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And he's waiting to be that story that makes you part of his story and part of history.